The call came just after dusk. The winter light already faded into a cold darkness over Rochester. Michael's voice rang bright and confident through the receiver. He told me he had reserved a lakeside hall in Buffalo for Christmas, describing the chandeliers, the musicians, and the 5-course meal as if he had orchestrated a grand gala. I listened in silence, imagining him standing tall among relatives, his voice carrying pride that had nothing to do with me. He spoke quickly, as though rehearsed, until at last his words slowed and his tone sharpened. "But, Mom," he said, "you won't be coming. Being a single old woman is a disgrace. It would embarrass everyone. Emily and Jacob can join us. Of course they'll have a wonderful time." I felt the world tighten around me, as if every sacrifice of the last 4 decades, every late shift at the college, every loan quietly repaid, every meal I went without collapsed into nothing more than shame in my own son's eyes. My breath stalled in my chest. I pressed the phone closer, waiting for him to laugh, to take it back, but all I heard was his steady breathing, impatient for my agreement. I murmured something vague and ended the call, my hand trembling as I set the receiver down. The quiet of the house pressed in around me, broken only by the hum of the radiator. For a moment, I stared at the familiar walls lined with old photographs, searching for the child I had once held, the boy who had clung to me after his father's funeral. But that boy was gone. What remained was a man who had turned me into a liability, and it was in that silence that the shape of my reply began to form. Sleep would not come that night. I lay beneath the quilt, the house creaking with the weight of winter, and my mind carried me back through the decades. Michael's words had cracked something open, and from that fracture poured the long history of how we had arrived here. I was 28 when my husband collapsed at the tool plant. The doctor said it was his heart, worn down by years of 12-hour shifts. I remember holding Michael, just a boy then, while Rachel clung to my skirt. There was no space for grief. There was only the mortgage, the grocery bills, the question of how to keep 2 children clothed and fed. I took the bookkeeping position at Monroe Community College, then added evening hours in the library. In those early years, exhaustion was my companion. I came home with aching feet and ink-stained fingers, often skipping supper so the children could have seconds. Michael never knew how many nights I sat by the kitchen table balancing the numbers until dawn, promising myself that education would free him from the cycle that had claimed his father. When Rachel's marriage crumbled years later, she returned to me with a baby and more debt than she could face. I sold the gold earrings my mother had left me, then the wedding bracelet I had once cherished. Each sale felt like cutting a thread from my own history, yet I told myself objects meant nothing compared to the lives of my children. I even let go of my grandmother's locket one bitter winter, trading it for enough to repair the furnace. I stood in that pawn shop feeling stripped bare, yet returned home smiling, because at least the house was warm. Now, decades later, sitting in the same kitchen where I had once hidden empty plates from the children, I felt the weight of it all. Every sacrifice I had made had not lifted me closer to love or respect. Instead, it had forged chains, links of obligation that bound me tighter each year. Michael's words had shown me those chains for what they were, and for the first time, I wondered if I had the strength to break them. The morning after Michael's call, I reached for the phone with a trembling hand. I told myself Rachel would understand, that she would remind me I still mattered. When she answered, her voice was weary, the background filled with the faint beep of hospital machines. She had just finished a night shift. I explained what Michael had said, every word still burning in my chest. She sighed softly. "Mom, you know how he is. He doesn't mean it the way it sounded. He's just thinking of appearances. The banquet is for his wife's family, too. He doesn't want anything to seem out of place. Appearances. The words settled like ash on my heart. I wanted to protest, to remind her that I had once sold the ring her father gave me so she could keep her apartment after the divorce, that I had carried her and Michael through storms that appearances never softened. Instead, I swallowed the protest, hearing her silence stretch across the line. "Rachel," I whispered, "do you think I'm a disgrace?" She didn't answer right away. At last, she said, "It's just one holiday. Don't let it upset you so much." Then the line went dead, and with it any hope I had clung to of her standing beside me. I sat for a long time, the receiver resting cold in my lap, until another name rose in my mind. Clara. My older sister had never been afraid to speak truth, even when it stung. When she answered, her voice was brisk but warm. I told her everything in one rush, barely pausing for breath. "Eleanor," she said firmly, "don't let them shame you. Respect is not optional. If your children can't give it, then you must give it to yourself." Her words cut through the fog that had wrapped itself around me. For the first time since Michael's call, I felt something other than despair. I felt a slow, steady flame rising in my chest, one that told me I could not go on as before. It was then that I began to imagine what my answer to him must truly be. I sat at the kitchen table with Clara's words echoing in my mind. Respect is not optional. The phrase hardened into something unshakable. My hands no longer trembled as I pulled a pad of paper toward me and began to write. At the top, I scrawled one sentence. "Then you won't be there either." It was all I needed to say. I opened my email and typed those words to Michael, my fingers steady. There was no room for apology, no explanation. I pressed send, and with that click, something inside me shifted. The years of begging for scraps of kindness were over. Next came the practical steps. I found the folder where I had tucked the banquet hall contract. The number was printed at the bottom. My voice surprised me when I called. It sounded calm, almost detached. "Yes, this is Eleanor Whitmore. I need to cancel the Christmas reservation." The woman on the line hesitated, asked for the reservation code, then said, "Of course, and ma'am, you'll be refunded the full $3,000. Relief swept through me. Not for the money alone, but for the sudden freedom of reclaiming it. The catering order was next. I remembered Michael's smug grin as he bragged about lobster bisque and carved roast beef. I dialed the caterer and canceled the $1,200 contract. They assured me no ingredients had been purchased, so the deposit would be returned. I hung up, the corners of my mouth curving upward. Finally, I called the garage. Just last month, Michael had begged me to co-sign for his truck repair, insisting he would repay me within weeks. I had been paying the installments myself. When I explained to the manager that I was withdrawing, he understood at once, and the account was frozen. When it was done, I turned to my computer and created a folder named Proof. Into it I began saving scanned receipts, contracts, and copies of Michael's message. If a reckoning came, I wanted the truth in order. The house was silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. Yet in that silence, I felt stronger than I had in years, ready for whatever storm would follow. On Christmas morning, I woke to the smell of cinnamon and the muffled laughter of Emily in the kitchen. She had risen early, tying my old apron around her waist, determined to help me bake pies. Her clumsy hands left flour streaked across the counter, but her grin lit the room brighter than any decoration. Together we rolled the dough, my fingers guiding hers as the radio played carols that I had not listened to in years without tears. By noon, the chicken was roasting in the oven, filling the house with a savory warmth that clung to every corner. I basted it slowly, savoring the ritual, while Emily set the table with the mismatched china I had collected over the decades. Outside, the wind whipped off Lake Ontario, rattling the windows. But inside our little dining room, a peace began to take shape. Eli arrived with his father, Rachel's ex-husband, who dropped him off with little more than a nod. He ran into the kitchen, pulling at my sleeve, asking if he could mash the potatoes. I handed him the whisk, and soon the rhythm of his small arms beat against the bowl while Emily hummed along with the radio. For a moment, I let myself believe this was enough, that the absence of the larger family did not matter. The afternoon passed with laughter and small arguments about who had eaten more pie, yet beneath my smile, there lingered a quiet ache, a reminder that my eldest child had chosen to shut me out. Still, when Emily clasped my hand across the table and said, "Grandma, this is the best Christmas dinner I've ever had," the ache softened. It was evening when Rachel finally appeared, her face pale and her coat unbuttoned against the cold. She stood in the doorway, taking in the sight of her children leaning against me, the remnants of pie on the plates, the glow of the small tree in the corner. Her eyes filled, though she tried to hide it. "I didn't think you'd still celebrate," she said quietly. I poured her a cup of coffee and set it before her, without a word. She looked at me for a long time, something shifting behind her tired gaze, as though she saw me not as a frail old woman, but as the anchor of everything that remained steady. The house was still fragrant with roasted chicken and cinnamon. When I realized that strength did not always roar, it could also rest quietly at the center of a table. And it was there, in that fragile peace, that the storm waiting in Buffalo began to gather. While my house in Rochester filled with the scent of roasted chicken, another scene was unfolding an hour west in Buffalo. Relatives from both sides of Michael's family had driven through snow, dressed in suits and sequined dresses, ready for a gala that never was. They stepped into the grand lakeside hall expecting music, light, and warmth. Instead, they found the doors locked and the foyer unlit. One uncle tried the handle twice before knocking against the glass. Inside, the lobby sat empty, the chandeliers dark, the reception desk unmanned. Confusion rippled through the group. Michael's wife, her heels clicking sharply against the stone, demanded answers. "This is supposed to be reserved under Whitmore," she said, her voice echoing. The manager appeared from the back, his expression calm but firm. "That reservation was canceled 3 days ago, refunded in full." He showed the paperwork without hesitation. Michael's face drained of color. He stammered something about a mistake, about calling back later. But the silence around him was heavier than snow. Whispers began, sharp and unmistakable. "Didn't his mother pay for all this?" one cousin muttered. Another relative shook her head. Michael's wife's parents crossed their arms, their faces twisted with disdain. What had been meant as a glittering display of status collapsed into something sour and humiliating. Meanwhile, Rachel, caught between families, texted me from the corner of the lobby. "Mom, is this true? Did you cancel it?" I read her message hours later, the glow of the Christmas tree still warming my living room. My fingers hovered over the keys before I replied. I only stepped aside, just as Michael asked. The rest was never mine to carry. By then, the hall in Buffalo had emptied, relatives slipping back into the snow, muttering about wasted time and broken trust. Michael was left standing in the foyer, his voice rising in futile explanations that no one believed. The grandeur he had promised dissolved into cold silence, and the weight of that silence would follow him home. I closed Rachel's message with a steady breath, knowing the reckoning was only beginning. That night, when the house had gone quiet and the dishes were stacked to dry, I turned on the old desk lamp in the corner of the living room. Its yellow glow spilled across the papers I had laid out in a careful row. The banquet hall refund notice, the catering cancellation, the statement from the garage, and finally, Michael's cruel message telling me not to come. Each document was a scar, but together, they formed a story that could no longer be twisted. I scanned them one by one, saving each file into the folder I had named Proof. My hands moved steadily, the rhythm soothing in its finality. When everything was gathered, I opened a blank email and addressed it to every relative whose address I still kept. For years, I had written checks, birthday cards, holiday invitations. Now the list was turned toward a different purpose. The subject line read simply, "The truth about Christmas." In the body, I wrote, "I regret that this year's gathering ended in confusion. To prevent further misunderstanding, I am sharing the facts. Please see the attached documents." With one deep breath, I pressed send. The attachment zipped off into the night, carrying more weight than any words I could have spoken aloud. It did not take long for replies to flood in. A cousin from Buffalo wrote first, "How could Michael do this to you?" Another from Syracuse followed quickly, demanding answers from Rachel, who had been caught in the middle. My phone buzzed again and again, each vibration a small crack in the wall Michael had built around himself. Rachel called at last, her voice trembling. "Mom, everyone's furious. Dad-in-law asked Michael point blank if he forged the reservations. He didn't deny it. He blamed you." She paused, her breath catching. "But the emails, the receipts, they've all seen them. They know the truth now." I listened quietly, the weight of years lifting, replaced not by triumph, but by a profound calm. The evidence had spoken, and nothing Michael said could silence it. By midnight, the house was still except for the ping of one last message. A cousin's terse words that I read twice before closing the laptop. "He'll never recover from this." In the weeks that followed, the silence around Michael grew heavier than any accusation I could have made. Word spread quickly in Buffalo, where his business relied on handshakes and trust. Contracts that once came easily began to dry up. Former clients found excuses not to return his calls, while others simply said they had heard enough to doubt his reliability. At home, the strain spilled into his marriage. His wife, who had smiled so brightly in front of her relatives, now looked at him with open contempt. The night she walked out, taking their son with her, he called Rachel in a panic. But even she could offer no comfort. By then, the family had seen too much. His truck, once the pride of his driveway, became the last asset he could barter. I heard through Clara that he sold it for barely $1,000, though he had paid $28,000 not 2 years before. The irony was bitter, the very symbol of his success reduced to a scrap of cash, swallowed quickly by debts he had never learned to manage. My parents, Richard and June, fared little better. Their circle in Columbus, built on reputation and weekend golf outings, dissolved almost overnight. Old friends stopped calling. At church, the polite greetings turned into awkward silences. They had stood behind Michael, and now they stood alone. In Rochester, my days took on a different rhythm. One Sunday after service, the pastor asked if I might consider joining the church's charity board. "You've shown wisdom under trial," he said. I accepted quietly, humbled by the respect I had thought forever lost. There were still lonely evenings when I felt the sting of what had been broken. But even then, the air in my home felt lighter. I no longer carried the weight of appearances, only the steadiness of truth. And with that steadiness came the faint outline of a new beginning, one that revealed itself more fully as winter melted slowly into spring. By February, the snow along Lake Ontario had begun to soften. gray edges giving way to patches of damp earth. Clara and I sat on a bench by the water, wrapped in scarves, while Emily skipped stones and Rachel stood watching her daughter with a faint smile. The cold air stung my cheeks, but I felt warmer than I had in years. Clara reached for my hand. "You know," she said, "I think you've carried this family longer than anyone realizes. Without you, there would have been nothing for them to stand on." Her words settled deep. For decades, I had thought of myself as the weak link, the widow, the burden, the one always apologizing for being alone. But looking at Emily's bright laughter, at Rachel's softened face, I knew Clara was right. I had not been the disgrace. I had been the foundation. Back in Rochester, the house that once echoed with loneliness slowly filled again. Rachel began visiting more often, sometimes staying the night after her shifts in Syracuse. Emily helped me polish the old dining table, declaring it the new holiday headquarters. Even Clara joined us on weekends, carrying her homemade bread and that steady wisdom I had always leaned on. I discovered new rhythms too. The community college reached out, asking if I would consider tutoring part-time in accounting. I accepted, not out of necessity, but out of joy. Meeting with younger students, guiding them through the puzzles of numbers, reminded me that my mind still held value. The modest income covered small comforts, fresh curtains, new shoes for Emily, but more than that. It restored a sense of purpose. The house became our hearth, not grand, not glittering, but steady. On Sunday afternoons, laughter drifted from the kitchen as pies baked and the radio played old hymns. I would sit with my ledger open, the fire crackling, while Emily practiced her essays and Rachel dozed on the couch. These were not the scenes of shame Michael had imagined. They were scenes of survival, and more than that, of renewal. And as I stood at the window one evening, watching the lake shimmer under the winter sun, I felt certain that the door I had closed had already led me toward others waiting to be opened.